Support for WUWM podcast comes from Hop Harvest and Vine and Good Harvest Market in Pewaukee, part of One Destination, combining farm-to-table dining, local craft beers, and organic groceries under one roof. More at goodharvestmarket.com.
Hey, welcome back. It's Jimmy. Today we are sharing our last story from our Making Wisconsin series, which is all about the immigration history of Milwaukee and Wisconsin, taking a look at how we got to where we are today. The definition of U.S. citizenship has always changed over time. What it means to be a citizen has changed too. Sometimes certain groups receiving more rights, and other times much less. Reporter Maria Peralta Arellano talks with Marquette history professor and author Sergio Gonzalez about this history and what it tells us about today.
So I want to take it back to the 1600s. That's kind of when a lot of people and a lot of movements start coming into the state, is around the 1600s. You've called this era the Wild West. Can you kind of explain what you meant by that and how that has to do with how we're classifying citizenship or the movement of people at this time?
Yeah, so I think the important thing to note, of course, is that the question of belonging has existed in this area that we now call Wisconsin, the United States, much longer than before this area was known as those places, right? And so if we think about the arrival of European colonists going back into the 17th century, specifically in the 18th century, they had different ways of understanding how they belonged to their nation, which may have been someone like France or the United Kingdom, or how they existed in relationship to other people who already lived here. So we think here about indigenous populations who have called Wisconsin home for much longer than Wisconsin has actually been a state. People who arrived here who were French or British defined themselves not along questions of citizenship, but of subjecthood. In other words, they belonged to the crown, right? And to their relationship to their home country was not defined so much in terms of voting and pieces of paper like a passport, but in terms of dominion and how the crown defined who belonged to those places. And then so we think about the American Revolution in the late 18th century. This is, of course, when American colonists begin to define a new form of political belonging. And this is when they really develop these concept of citizenship, which is to say that individuals who live within a space have the right of self-governance. They get to decide what the boundaries of belonging are. And they also get to decide who gets to belong within those spaces. I think you look moving into places like Wisconsin, specifically in the 1840s and 1850s, you see some of these new states that are popping up that have a very different relationship to citizenship, because during this period of the 19th century, states actually defined the parameters of citizenship. The federal government played a pretty minimal role in that process.
So what did statehood mean at this time, and how did that change our ideas of citizenship as we were approaching that possibility and then that certification?
Yeah, so before 1848, when Wisconsin becomes a state, Wisconsin is a territory, and politicians and business leaders here in the territory want to push Wisconsin to become a state. And there's, of course, a numerical threshold you have to hit. In 1836, there were about 11,000 people who lived in Wisconsin, which was much too small, right? And so they had to invite people into this region so they could hit that threshold so that they could become an actual state, to move from territory to statehood. And so one of the things they do is they invite German immigrants into this region beginning into the late 1830s and really into the early 1840s. In 1846 to 1848, the Wisconsin territorial legislature begins to come together to actually craft a constitution, which will eventually be passed in 1848. And if you actually read the original constitution passed in 1848, you see the ways in which immigrants had a certain amount of power here in the state of Wisconsin, and the way in which Wisconsin wanted to continue to be a place that could invite immigrants to populate this space, right? So Article 3, which defines suffrage in the state of Wisconsin, in other words, who's allowed to vote. I'm just going to read from it, if that's all right, so we can kind of familiarize ourselves, right? So Section 1 reads, every male person of the age of 21 years or upwards who shall have resided in the state for 1 year, next year presiding in the election, shall be deemed a qualified elector at such election, right? So any person, male person, aged 21 years or older, who had lived in the state for a year would be allowed to vote in the election. That included, according to Article 3, white persons of foreign birth who shall have declared their intention to become citizens within the next year. You didn't actually have to be a citizen to vote here. That was passed in 1848. Wisconsin had that law on the books until 1908. And I'll just note if I can, right? I mean, there's an important note to say that there are very clear limits on who is allowed to vote in 1848, right? It's these immigrants, but it's specifically white men. In the 1846 proposition, right, so before the 1848 Constitution, in 1846 at the first constitutional convention here in Wisconsin, it was proposed that free black Wisconsinites would also be allowed to vote. It was also proposed that women would be allowed to vote. There are different kind of worlds that could have existed in the 1840s, 1850s here in the state of Wisconsin, but the world in which our kind of forefathers here in the state decided to go with was one in which every male person aged 21 years or upwards who was a white man would be allowed to participate in the process of suffrage.
So when did we start really developing those modern institutions and processes we see today that handle immigration and handle citizenship?
Yeah, so to really drive home this point that Wisconsin was a place that was full of economic opportunity, or at least that's the way in which elected officials and business leaders saw the state, and so they really wanted to populate it. One of the ways in which the state of Wisconsin tried to entice people to come to this region and really bring them into the state was through actual government institutions. So in 1852, the Wisconsin State Legislature actually creates the Wisconsin Office of Immigration, right? They actually allocate money. They create an immigration officer whose responsibility is to go to New York City and wait at the wharfs, like he's actually waiting at the docks, passing out literature, publicizing the state of Wisconsin and how wonderful the opportunities are here. So they were specifically looking for German immigrants, British immigrants, Welsh immigrants, and Scandinavian immigrants to come to Wisconsin, people who they felt would be comfortable in the state because of the population that already lived here and because they felt like parts of Wisconsin kind of replicated what life was like in Europe for some of these populations. So that office exists in different formats throughout the 19th century, right? Sometimes it's defunded and then it comes back. And we can see the way in which that funding happens for the Office of Immigration depending on waves of nativism that are sweeping across the country. So at those moments that Americans become very anxious about the growing immigrant population, there's a backlash, right? So in the 1840s and 1850s, there's something called the Know Nothing Party, which is this anti-immigrant party that is pushing to kind of close the borders of the nation to European immigration. And the office is defined at that time. And this office kind of exists in fits and starts throughout the 19th century, really represents the way in which Wisconsin was trying to recruit a very specific type of person to the state. And it really ends in the early 20th century when immigration becomes a much more nationalized issue, right? And so in the late 19th century, the U.S. Congress passes a series of laws, the first sets of exclusionary laws, which mean to basically shut the border to Chinese immigrants who are arriving, looking to work in the U.S. West. And then the early 20th century, the federal Congress begins to introduce a series of laws that really begin to tighten who is allowed to come to the country, under what circumstances, what type of education a person has, what access to money they might have, what their relationship to work might be. And so by the early 20th century, what had been a state issue, right, where individual states took up a lot of that work, has now become a federal issue. And the U.S. Congress is now really setting the parameters by which a person is allowed into the country and by which they may become a citizen of the nation as well.
I'm WWM's Maria Peralta Ariano speaking with Marquette history professor Sergio Gonzalez. I kind of want to bring up the 14th Amendment. It's something that's been popping up a lot lately in our modern conversations of citizenship. So the 14th Amendment gave way to birthright citizenship specifically for formerly enslaved people in 1867. So how did this shift the idea of who is American?
Yeah, so the 14th Amendment is this effort by Congress to finally address this issue of black citizenship in the nation, right? I mean, this is, of course, the driver for the Civil War. The 14th Amendment, of course, begins that process of dismantling the institution of slavery, but also building up this concept of federal citizenship, which is to say that a person who is born in the United States is granted with that question of citizenship, no questions asked. Right. And so that, however, doesn't really define what citizenship is. It just says who a citizen is in its founding in the 14th Amendment. And so the history really of everything since the establishment of the 14th Amendment has been a question of how Americans have grappled with what citizenship actually entails, right? And who actually has access to all of those different pieces, whether it's questions of who can own property, who can vote, who can have a passport, and the relationships to the state, that has continued to be worked out. And of course, we know today in 2025 that even the concept of birthright citizenship for some Americans continues to be an open question, although for the courts, it is certainly not. It has been adjudicated and re-adjudicated so many times that it seems to have just been established law. But we are living in times where that might be questioned.
With the questioning of birthright citizenship, the Bracero program in the 1940s, bringing in temporary workers from Mexico to fill labor shortages during war times. We also had migrant workers. Many of them were Tejano, which is a unique identity in the rainbow of Latino identities. So how did these people, these groups, how did that play into the conversation of citizenship and then also the program itself?
Yeah, so 1940s, the United States has entered into World War II. It's in dire need of workers. And so the United States looks down to Mexico as well as a series of other Latin American, Caribbean nations to help it do the work of filling its farms and its factories. And so according to this agreement signed between the United States and Mexico in 1942, the U.S. is allowed to functionally import labor from Mexico. And these individuals sign these limited-term contracts in Mexico, right? And they're sent up by train. They're brought up all across the United States. Many of them work in places like California and Texas, but Wisconsin also becomes home to braceros, to these Mexican farm workers in the 1940s and 1950s. I think the important thing to note is that these people are brought up for only one reason, that is to work. And so when they sign these contracts, they are being brought up as what is often referred to as guest workers. And the United States has had guest worker programs all the way into the early decades of the 20th century. But the Bracero program kind of represents this really rapid escalation and this kind of really big growth in this program. These workers, when they arrive in the United States, they have this really tenuous stance in the country because the contracts that they've signed with the United States and Mexico is supposed to afford them rights as laborers, but it affords them no rights as citizens, right? So they're certainly not allowed to vote. There is no pathway to citizenship for them. And really their sort of political voice is very much constrained. And that plays out pretty clearly in their working situations. I mean, these are kind of situations that are ripe for exploitation, and that's what happens to these Mexican farm workers. It also, unfortunately, also depresses wages here for American farm workers in the United States, and so there's an immediate blowback among American farmers who see the Bracero program as a way to strip their ability to unionize and to bargain for their own wages. And so these guest worker programs, which have existed in our country and continue to exist in this country today, are very complicated labor programs, but they also speak to the questions of citizenship. What does it mean to only exist in this country as a worker and never have a pathway to citizenship, to never have a pathway to full inclusion of political belonging in this country? That kind of plays out with the Mexican-American farm workers you mentioned, these Texas Mexicans, Tejano farm workers who are American citizens. They arrive in Wisconsin at the exact same time. And even though they are American citizens, they often find that they're treated the exact same way as these Bracero workers are treated, which is to say like second-class or no-class citizens at all. And so they're petitioning for better working conditions, better living conditions, often without any sort of reprieve, really not until the 1960s when they're able to build effective social movements to push back against these labor systems.
We're mentioning a lot of times that things are coming in waves. Is there any place in history where we can kind of see similar thoughts and feelings towards citizenship that we're seeing now?
Yeah, I think, Mark Twain is famous for having said, at least apocryphally, that history doesn't repeat itself, it just rhymes, right? And so we can see parallels. It never lays on so perfectly. But I think historians have kind of pointed to the 1920s as an era that seems starkly familiar today. We're 100 years away from that, a period of rising nativism where Americans at least voting Americans have become quite anxious about what they believe to be the changing demographics of the nation. And they feel that the United States has a responsibility to respond to that. And so what that has led to, at least in the last presidential election, has been the invitation of a very specific executive power that believes it has the right to continue to constrain the boundaries of citizenship and boundaries of belonging in the United States. And of course, we're seeing that play out every single day here in 2025, which is to say that people who perhaps could have taken it for granted that they had protections in this country, legal protections, no longer feel safe. Right? And that's played out a lot of different ways. It's not just undocumented immigrants in this country who now are afraid of their status in this country and a sense of belonging. It's people who have access to things like temporary protected status. It's people who are resident aliens in the nation. It's students who are here on visas who we have seen in the news, of course, have been functionally abducted in broad daylight by immigration and customs officers. And I think the important thing to know, of course, then is that citizenship, which we might take for granted as kind of this ironclad thing, has never existed as a finite political or legal structure. It's something that we as a society get to decide how it shifts. And that can be both something that can be constraining, in other words, that we can think about a smaller group of people who can be included in citizenship, but alternatively, that also means that we can have the imagination to think about a world in which the concept of citizenship is broader, that more people can see themselves within the boundaries of belonging in our nation or in our local communities.
A lot of people also point to the fact that there's also tribal citizenship and tribal sovereignty. What is the difference for the people who may not be familiar, and how are we factoring that now also into our conversation of citizenship and who belongs?
Yeah, so Wisconsin is home to a series of native tribes that have politically recognized sovereign rights in this nation, which means that they have their own form of citizenship within the nation, but they're also citizens of the United States. And I think we might take it for granted in 2025 that this has been the way that it is for quite some time. But in fact, it's a relatively new concept that has taken a long time to be figured out. And it has come at the expense, of course, of native tribes' ability to live in the place that they wanted to live. And so Wisconsin doesn't exist as a state in 1848 without the displacement of many native peoples who called this place home for millennia before that. And then, of course, the establishment of reservation spaces where people's political belonging and the right to exist is kind of confined within very specific locations, whether it's in the state of Wisconsin or moving westward outside of what was once this territory and later this state. And so the thing that I always emphasize when I talk about the Indian Citizenship Act of 1924, is that the question of citizenship is often, we think of it as something that people are striving for, but it can be also something that's imposed. And so, this is something that when Congress passes the Indian Citizenship Act of 1924, they're imposing a sense of citizenship on a group of people that have a very complicated relationship to citizenship, both because of this long history of displacement and of political disempowerment, but also because these sovereign nations have a relationship to their own political citizenship within the boundaries of their own native nation states.
What are the pros and cons of someone who is newly being factored into citizenship?
Yeah, I think, citizenship offers you protections, right? I mean, and we see this today in 2025 when people who are, legal permanent residents or visa holders who are not citizens realize that that's a very important distinction. Right, the fact that the state can enact certain legal procedures and, in fact, enact violence against you because you're not a citizen. So I think one of the most important things is that it protects you from the federal government. But I think just to think of citizenship as kind of this black and white space of like whether or not you're protected rips apart some of those other aspects of what it means to belong in a place like the United States, which is to say that there are plenty of people who want citizenship because it allows them to claim a sense of belonging in this nation, right? And so if you were to go to a naturalization ceremony in Milwaukee or across this country, you would see people who have gone through quite a process. All right, people who have left their home country and who have made the conscious decision to become American citizens. And that brings with it a lot of weight, a lot of pressures, perhaps the abandonment of something, but also the creation of something new. And I think the expectation, the hope is that once you achieve that questions of American citizenship, that it will also bring entry into the larger body of the nation and the community that you now call home. The reality, of course, is that people have always had varied relationships to citizenship, even when they've been able to achieve it.
That was reporter Maria Peralta Arellano and Marquette history professor and author Sergio Gonzalez. The conversation originally aired last year as part of our Making Wisconsin series. Music in this episode is from Blue Dot Sessions. Status Pending is produced by WUWM, Milwaukee's NPR, part of the NPR network. And do not worry, we are not going anywhere. You can stick with us for more stories about immigration in Wisconsin.